just want to preface this by saying that my opinions are about the game prior to Dawntrail. I know that this expansion has been pretty divisive amongst the community, so everything I'll be talking about in this video will reflect my feelings up until Endwalker. This video will also contain spoilers up to Endwalker. If you haven't played up to said expansion, then this is your spoiler warning. I also want to include that I was never super involved in the RP community, raid community, or any other groups that may or may not have had their own separate issues from the game as a whole, so my experience will differ from many other players. It was around 2019, and I was desperately looking for another game to sink my time into. I spent too much time playing multiplayer PvP games, getting frustrated and just not having fun. I was craving something else to invest my time into. Something that made me happy instead of irritated. And then, after skipping past the advertisement countless times on various platforms, I finally set my eyes on a Final Fantasy title that put me off completely in the past due to the subscription-based MMO genre, Final Fantasy XIV. Before Final Fantasy XIV, my history of MMOs consisted of MapleStory, Dragon Nest, Mabinogi, Elsword, Runescape, and many others, in all of which I was free to play. The first time I was ever introduced to the concept of subscription-based MMOs were with Runescape and Final Fantasy XI, but I was much too young at the time to understand the latter. My perception of the subscription-based model at the time was that I was forced to play this game for however long I was subscribed for in order to get the most value. This was the sole reason why I stayed away from ever subscribing to a game. From my own personal experience, whatever content that was available for free-to-play players was significantly lower in quality or short enough to entice you into investing money into it for a better experience, whether that be a subscription or other microtransactions. So when I saw that Final Fantasy XIV had a free trial, I was skeptical. At this point, many of us have heard the sales pitch for said free trial. The critically acclaimed MMORPG with a free trial up to level 60 with no time limit. I've seen and heard this many times throughout my years of gaming and always thought it was too good to be true, expecting the real experience to be what I described. But at this point, I was desperate to try anything new, so I finally downloaded the game. At this point, I had not seen any of the cinematics or trailers, so I was going in mostly blind. The opening sequence upon entering the game after creating your character had me quite excited. It had that nostalgic feeling and charm of stepping foot into a brand new world, eager to explore the places, people, and story. Once I was fully dropped into the game, I hated it. It wasn't exactly the best looking game in the world, but I usually don't let visuals affect my enjoyment unless it's really egregious. First impressions? The area itself was relatively nice. The UI was about on par with what I would expect from an MMO. A little clutter that needed some cleaning up. The minimap was confusing, combat was very slow and boring, abilities were on a global cooldown and it was enough to put me to sleep. The quests were not very clear. The list of things I disliked went on and on. The combination of all these made me close the game within 30 minutes of playing and I immediately deleted the game. Fast forward several months later, my friends and I enjoy spending nights on Discord where we go through a bunch of media we've been enjoying and throw it up on a screen share. Video games, movies, TV shows, music, anything we felt that was worth sharing. This night in particular, the topic was video game OSTs. During this time, and even still to this day, Nier Automata was my favorite game of all time. I had stumbled upon a video, Final Fantasy XIV, Weight of the World. At first glance, I thought it was just a fan-made mashup of Weight of the World and a song from Final Fantasy XIV, but after listening to it for a quick few seconds, my jaw instantly dropped to the floor. I mean, the players in this video were fighting against characters from my favorite game. I had to stop the song immediately. A couple of my friends were really into Nier as well, so I wanted all of us to experience it firsthand together during one of these nights, and we were absolutely blown away. Hearing an incredible song from my favorite game of all time be put into a franchise that I loved while fighting with and against characters from the same game, it was something straight out of a fanfic. There was something special here, and I desperately wanted to find out what. And so, because of this one song, I decided to give Final Fantasy XIV another shot. I'll be completely honest, I don't remember much playing through the base game A Realm Reborn. All the gripes I had were still there, but I was determined to power through, because a game that's been around for this long had to have something worthwhile to keep players invested. Quest after quest, dungeon after dungeon, I ran through the base game as quick as I could. I'd also be lying if I said I didn't skip all the dialogue, much to the dismay to many people. But that's mainly because everything I had read about the base game was that it was quite boring and I could watch a lore recap video later. In those same reviews, most of them agreed that the game improves significantly once I reached the first expansion, Heavensward. After seeing the trailer, I was immediately hooked. The darker tone, atmosphere, and most importantly, dragons. Growing up as a kid, Final Fantasy III was my first Final Fantasy game that I played myself, and I was obsessed with the Dragoon class. The cool edgy job with spiky armor that jumps into the sky. Kid Kai was mesmerized, and seeing how the Dragoons take center stage in this expansion, Final Fantasy XIV finally had my full and undivided attention. Watching the Dragoons and all their cinematic glory had me far more invested than the slog through A Realm Reborn. This was also before they removed a large number of quests from the post-game, dubbed the 100 Quest of Shame. The content had me extremely invested. Between the story, characters, and playable content, I was starting to see the magic behind why so many people loved this game for so long. Although there were a few rough patches here and there, this sentiment stayed pretty consistent throughout my entire journey through Final Fantasy XIV. Stormblood's story wasn't amazing, but the content was fantastic. Shadowbringers had both an incredible story and enjoyable content. Endwalker also had an amazing story and the content was decent. I was addicted. So much so that I began looking into the history of the game's origins. At this point, it's fairly well known within the relevant gaming spaces that Final Fantasy XIV's initial launch was a disaster, an unfinished and messy release that was shut down but was redeemed by a 2.0 that practically saved the company and the Final Fantasy franchise. All thanks to the man we've all grown to know and love, director and producer Naoki Yoshida, otherwise referred to as Yoshi P. This was a man that adored gaming and truly wanted to create a game that fully represents that, and it was through Yoshi P that the development team showed that they also shared this sentiment. This was the first time I had ever seen a team so devoted to creating something special. A team that put all their blood, sweat, tears, and more into a project that didn't reek of corporate PR nonsense. These were human beings that cared about their game. And these were people I truly wanted to support because I felt like I could really trust them. They even went so far as to use the shutdown of the original game and made it canonical lore for the new game. And that's something you don't see much of anymore in the modern gaming industry. We all know the drill at this point. Free to download game, battle pass, paid cosmetics, or gameplay elements. This is the typical formula we see for most modern day live service games. Fortnite, Apex Legends, The Finals, almost every live service game has a battle pass nowadays, and for better or worse, it works. My thought process is that if you purchase a battle pass regularly, that is essentially a subscription as well. You just get the choice of whether or not you want to opt into it. Of course, the big difference between a typical monthly subscription compared to a battle pass is that you can still play the freemium game and not be hard-locked out of playable content for the most part, outside of DLC or expansions. For me personally, this type of model really drains the life and art out of the product. The idea of only having a limited time to complete a battle pass removes the fun aspect from a game. It becomes more of a chore. I don't want to grind content because I feel like I have to, but because I want to. Of course, there are events or special occasions where certain rewards are only available for a certain time period, but those are typically around for just that, special occasions. However, with Final Fantasy XIV, every content update that comes after a major expansion is added for free. Yes, compared to a free-to-play game, a subscription-based model requires you to purchase the game, the monthly subscription for however long you're looking to play for, and the major expansion. But there's always going to be something to do. Are you a hardcore raider? Done. Do you enjoy crafting and gathering? Done. Want to open up your very own player-run nightclub where you can hire other players to serve you food and drinks in an RP setting? Not entirely for me, but also done. When every moment you play a game is put on a timer, it removes that special factor. I know it's ironic to say since you are on a timed subscription, but Final Fantasy XIV makes it so that all content outside of special events, regardless of when it was released, is relevant. Maybe there's an old mount you didn't get from a previous expansion. You can go back and grind for it. Maybe there was a certain gear set that you like the look of. You can go back to an old dungeon and grind for that too. The key factor here is that you have a multitude of choices. Nowadays, it feels like the only choice you have in many live service games are to buy or not to buy in regards to battle passes or any other extra content. This is a game that really respects your time. As I mentioned earlier, the gameplay was not something I enjoyed initially. It was especially rough for when you're first starting out because of the limited amount of abilities that you had that were all on the same cooldown. So it felt more like a waiting game until an enemy died instead of actual thought-provoking combat. Of course, you gain access to many more abilities as you level up, but it still hadn't clicked with me yet. I was just mindlessly pressing whatever buttons were available, and if I died, well, that's the healer's job. Get up, repeat again. It wasn't until I reached the post-game of the second expansion, Stormblood, that I actually started to think, wow, this is actually kind of difficult and I'm just useless. I had finally hit a wall where the content was difficult and I actually had to understand what I was doing, why I was doing it, and even where I was doing it. From actually reading what my abilities did, learning and understanding boss mechanics, and knowing how to put these together, the game became significantly more complicated and I was genuinely excited to actually learn the game properly in a challenging way. I learned that there was a structure and flow to all the abilities. There were 1, 2, 3 combos while weaving in other abilities. This became almost rhythmic in nature and is known as your rotation. To oversimplify it, it became a matter of memorization. But being able to remember your combos while also memorizing the dungeon and boss mechanics proved to be a whole new layer of complexity. The structure of each category of content followed a very similar, if not identical, layout. Dungeons start you with clearing through weaker enemies, throw in a puzzle or a mechanic here and there, defeat the mini-boss, and then repeat these steps maybe 2 or 3 more times until you reach the final boss. Trials were 8-player encounters where each player had important roles and positions that had to come together in unison in order to overcome. And raids were almost the same, but to a larger scale with more players and enemies. You would think that after a while that this would become tedious, but on the contrary, it had me even more excited to be an expert at my class as well as the content I was running, so that I can lead other party members to clear them more efficiently. Now, combine all of those elements and put them in beautifully designed areas coupled with incredible music, and you have a truly unforgettable experience. Even with everything I just described, the combat still won't be the craziest thing to write home about, but it is passable. It's not going to be anything exciting like New World, Black Desert Online, or Phantasy Star Online, but it gets the job done. Although it does become more intense and fun in higher difficulties, I'm really just going through the motions after hundreds of hours of muscle memory. When you look at the combat itself, it's not all that impressive aside from a few flashy effects or animations, but everything I listed as a whole package makes for a pretty solid experience. Before I knew much about the game, I read many claims that the story in Final Fantasy XIV was on par, if not better, than the mainline Final Fantasy games. As someone who is a huge fan of the Final Fantasy franchise, 10 being my favorite, this was a very bold claim that sounded way too good to be true, way too high of praise. It's an MMO. How could the story even remotely be as good as a full single-player game that's built around a well-crafted story? At the time, I had played through or have seen Final Fantasies 1 through 4, 7, 10, 10-2, 13, Lightning Returns, 15, and Type 0. I know I'm missing a few other big hitters such as 8, 12, and Tactics, just to name a few, but I consider myself a pretty avid fan of the franchise. With varying opinions on each game here and there, having an MMO story be compared to the perceived holy land of storytelling games was sacrilege. As I said earlier, A Realm Reborn as well as post-game did not have me captivated in the slightest. While I have seen those who took the time to really analyze and absorb the story of A Realm Reborn say that it's actually quite good, the telling of the story was very boring to me. Heavensward finally grabbed my attention with a pretty safe Final Fantasy type story, which isn't a bad thing, but was pretty much in line with what I would expect from a Final Fantasy story. Stormblood's story was relatively mixed for me. Anything regarding the Empire had me less interested. At this point, they were just evil for evil's sake and felt like Power Ranger villains. Big Bad Empire wants to take over. Anything regarding Doma, however, had me thoroughly invested. Although I found the main story to be a bit lacking, it more than made up for it with its characters and content. There was much more life and personality here than in the base game and previous expansion. I said earlier that I felt like the story of Heavensward was very safe because it was a mostly serious tone throughout it, with very little lighthearted moments. Stormblood had plenty of moments that showed different sides to existing characters that we haven't entirely seen before. Characters that were portrayed as serious or stoic most of the time went through goofy moments and it was a very welcome change of pace. Nothing sudden or jarring that it felt out of place, but felt appropriate enough to include. There were still serious moments throughout the story, but it didn't take itself too seriously, but maintained the level of intensity when the need for it arose. The content and gameplay was much better in this expansion, especially in the post-game. This felt like the real first step Final Fantasy XIV took to really separate itself from not only other MMORPGs, but also its Final Fantasy counterparts. Then, we finally get to the big hitter, the most beloved and well-received expansion in the history of the game's lifespan. This was the expansion where many players made the claim that the story had some of the best writing the game had to offer and rivals other Final Fantasy stories, if not surpassed them. This was where I was really going to judge the game, so my expectations going into it were very high, and yet they were still surpassed. For the first time since starting my journey, this expansion had me questioning if whether what we were doing was good or not. As I continued through Shadowbringers, the story constantly challenged everything we had done up to this moment, and I often found myself asking, are we the bad guys? Even as we defeated the antagonist, it left a bittersweet and almost unsatisfying feeling in a very well-written way. It was more than just good versus evil. It was the clashing of two ideologies that were both very valid. The storytelling from base Shadowbringers all the way through its post-expansion updates had me completely awestruck. Then, the expansion to wrap up a 10-year-old story, we arrive at Endwalker. Going into this expansion, my expectations were already exceedingly high from the bar that was set by Shadowbringers. This expansion takes a slower pace as it gives us much more time to delve into the personal lives of our favorite characters, old and new, meeting the twins' parents, going to lunch with our adult children, and revisiting some old but familiar faces for even more backstory. As I grow older, I've come to thoroughly enjoy these slower and more wholesome moments in conjunction with the action-packed moments that take center stage. Seeing these characters in some of their weaker moments has been incredibly engaging for me and made me love them even more. I spent a lot of time talking about the quality of the story, but my point in doing so is to address how each expansion improves upon an aspect with each update. The development team are very receptive and truly take in player feedback. I know this is a debatable statement in the hardcore raiding community, but for a more casual player like myself, I feel as though there's always an improvement, even if there are other parts that are lacking. It's because of this reception of feedback that I feel like the developers genuinely care about creating an enjoyable experience. Recently, the team addressed growing concerns that the game was becoming too easy. They acknowledged this and promised to create more difficult content. Now, whether or not they follow through with this promise, we will have to see. But it's the acknowledgement of community sentiment that reassures my trust placed on them. A real sense of connection with their player base and community. Something many games and companies struggle with or just straight up neglect nowadays. When it comes to video games or media in general, one of my favorite parts of experiencing them is recognizing patterns or recurring themes in the soundtrack, specifically leitmotifs. Admittedly, I didn't even know that it was called a leitmotif until this game, but basically, a leitmotif is defined as a recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. Let's take Heavensward's theme for example. Now, while keeping that melody in mind, listen and pay attention to these next few songs also featured in the Heavensward expansion. These are the things that make gaming moments stand out and make us fall in love with the medium. This is the type of stuff I live for. Final Fantasy XIV utilizes leitmotifs constantly throughout the entirety of the game. In the base game, there are recognizable tracks here and there with instances of Final Fantasy's trademark theme, the Crystal Prelude. But from the first expansion onwards, Final Fantasy XIV's composer really drives home his musical expertise, and for someone like me, who nerds out over this kind of stuff, this had me absolutely addicted and desperate to hear what else the game had to offer. As the quality of the big moments continued to improve with each new expansion, coupling those moments with an incredible soundtrack made for truly unforgettable moments. Outside of the game itself, the development team has shown that they're not just developers, but gamers themselves. and really get involved with the community, whether it be live streaming upcoming updates, conducting interviews with prominent content creators, or even tackling 14's difficult content themselves. These individuals have shown that they truly love the game and want to do their best to create an enjoyable experience for everyone. I know this has pretty much become a review of Final Fantasy XIV, but my point in explaining all of this is that there is a lot of love and passion put into this game, and even though it is a live service subscription-based model, it has as much heart and soul as any other beloved game on the market. It doesn't rely on a battle pass or constant logins to keep the game enjoyable. It's as enjoyable as you want it to be. The director has even gone on record to say that if you're bored with the game, unsub, spend time with your loved ones, or even play a different game. And if there's something that catches your eye later down the line, you can come on back anytime. I just want to reiterate that everything I spoke about today is completely subjective and just my own personal opinion. How people want to spend their time and money is completely up to them and is none of my business. But in an industry where the success of many games depend on constant player retention, it's nice to be able to hop onto a game that's been around for so long and it still be something special each time you come back. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This video has been in the works for a long time due to my own procrastination, but I'm finally to have been able to put it out there. My experience and opinion is going to differ from a lot of people's, but for me, it truly is a special game that changed my perspective on live service games. It's not going to be for everyone, and that's totally okay, but I think it definitely deserves a fair shot. If you like this video, please leave a like, share, and maybe consider subscribing for more video essays like this one. I also stream every night on Twitch at 8 PM Eastern, and I'll have it on screen here and also in the description below. We're currently playing through Dawntrail, but I also play a variety of other games like Souls-likes, Yakuza, Persona, Resident Evil, and many others. So if any of those pique your interest, or if you want to just hang out, it would mean a lot to me if you stopped on by and maybe consider giving a follow. We always have a good time. But for now, thank you again for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.
遥かな西、海の向こうに、ヴィンランドという名の土地がある。そこは暖かく、豊かで、奴隷商人も戦の炎を届かない。遠い地だ。